I never thought retirement in northern Minnesota would land me in a legal battle with a woman named Brenda, who measured property lines with a tape measure and cited HOA bylaws like they were the Ten Commandments. But there I was, 58 years old, divorced, and staring at a $500 fine for clearing snow off my own driveway with a snowplow attachment I'd bought at an estate sale for $200. My name is Frank Bradshaw, and I moved to Whispering Pines community in Duluth after 32 years working as a heavy equipment operator for mining companies across the Iron Range. The subdivision looked peaceful when I bought my place in late August, with its neat rows of houses and manicured lawns backing up to a stretch of woods. The realtor mentioned the HOA fees were reasonable at $75 a month, and I figured that was fine since they handled road maintenance and snow removal for the main streets. What she didn't mention was that the HOA president, Brenda, treated the community covenants like her personal fiefdom and enforced rules that weren't even written down. The first snowfall came in early November, just a dusting that melted by noon. I was unpacking boxes in my garage when I heard a sharp knock on my door. Standing there was a woman in her mid-40s with shoulder-length blonde hair that looked salon-fresh despite the cold wind, wearing a puffy white jacket and holding a clipboard like it was a shield. "Hello, I'm Brenda, HOA president. You must be Frank Bradshaw." She didn't smile when she said it. "That's me. What can I do for you?" I kept my tone friendly, though something about the way she gripped that clipboard made me wary. "I wanted to welcome you to the community and remind you about our covenant restrictions. No vehicles parked on the street overnight, no exterior modifications without board approval, and absolutely no commercial equipment stored on residential property." Her eyes drifted past me to the garage where I'd parked my Ford F-250. "Good to know. I'll keep that in mind. I noticed you have a rather large truck. That's acceptable, but if you're planning to attach a snowplow blade, you'll need to submit a request form. Commercial snow removal operations aren't permitted within Whispering Pines." I blinked at her. "I'm not running a business. I just like to clear my own driveway. The covenants are very specific about maintaining aesthetic standards." The HOA contracts with Northern Star Snow Services for all winter maintenance. Individual snow removal can create drainage issues and damage to shared property. My driveway is on my property. Brenda's smile tightened. "Your property, Mr. Bradshaw, is subject to the covenants you signed when you purchased the home. I'll send you the relevant documentation. Have a wonderful day." She turned and walked back to her pristine white SUV before I could respond. I should have paid more attention to that conversation. Instead, I figured she was just overzealous and I'd avoid any issues by keeping my head down. That plan lasted exactly 3 weeks. The real snow came the day before Thanksgiving. Duluth got hammered with 14 inches overnight, and I woke up to a driveway buried under heavy, wet snow that would take hours to shovel by hand. The snowplow attachment I'd bought was sitting in my garage, a perfectly good piece of equipment that would make quick work of the job. So I bolted it onto my truck and spent 45 minutes clearing not just my driveway, but also my elderly neighbors on the left side. Her name was Dorothy Chen, a widow in her 70s who baked incredible pies and had mobility issues. She came out when I finished and thanked me with tears in her eyes. "You're a blessing, Frank. The HOA service doesn't come through until afternoon, and I needed to get to my daughter's house this morning." "Happy to help, Dorothy. You get going before the roads get worse." I felt good about that morning. I felt like I'd done something decent for someone who needed it. That warm feeling lasted until noon when I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal notice printed on HOA letterhead. Violation notice. Unauthorized commercial equipment operation. Resident Frank Bradshaw, 2847 Pineview Drive, operated commercial snow removal equipment on community property on November 23 at approximately 7:15 a.m. This violates Section 12.3 of the Whispering Pines Community Covenants. Fine assessed, $500. Payment due within 14 days. I read it 3 times, certain there was some mistake. I called the number listed at the bottom and got Brenda's voicemail. I left a message explaining that I wasn't running a commercial operation. I was just clearing my own property, and I'd helped a neighbor who needed assistance. She called back 2 hours later. Mr. Bradshaw, the covenants are quite clear. Commercial equipment includes snowplows, regardless of the operator's intent. I'm not charging anyone money. How is that commercial? The equipment itself is classified as commercial grade. You're creating liability issues for the association. What if you damaged the street surface? What if your neighbor slipped on improperly cleared snow and sued the HOA? That's ridiculous. I cleared the snow better than your contracted service does. That's not the point. The point is maintaining order and standards within our community. The fine stands. You can appeal to the board at next month's meeting if you wish. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, feeling my blood pressure climb. $500 for clearing snow off my own driveway. $500 for helping an elderly neighbor. I dealt with difficult supervisors and corporate bureaucracy for 3 decades, but this was something else entirely. This was petty tyranny dressed up in covenants and bylaws. I decided to fight it. I spent the next week researching HOA law in Minnesota, and I learned that while HOAs had broad authority to enforce covenants, they couldn't create arbitrary rules that weren't explicitly stated in the governing documents. I requested a copy of the full covenants from the management company and read through 62 pages of dense legal language. Section 12.3 mentioned commercial operations, but defined them as businesses conducted from residential properties for profit. Clearing my own snow didn't fit that definition. The December board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the entrance that doubled as a voting location and rec center. I arrived at 7 p.m. to find about 20 other residents scattered in folding chairs. Brenda sat at a table up front with 4 other board members, 3 of whom looked bored and uncomfortable. The 4th was a stern-looking man in his 60s named Gerald Kowalski, who I'd learned was Brenda's main supporter. The meeting dragged through budget reports and landscaping discussions before Brenda finally called for new business. I raised my hand. "Yes, Mr. Bradshaw, you're here about your violation notice." I stood up, keeping my voice level. "I am. I'd like to appeal the $500 fine." I wasn't operating a commercial business. I was clearing snow from my own property and helping an elderly neighbor. Section 12.3 specifically defines commercial operations as businesses conducted for profit. Brenda didn't even look at the covenant book in front of her. The board has discretion to interpret covenant violations based on the spirit of the rules, not just the letter. Your use of commercial equipment violates the community standards we're trying to maintain. What standard am I violating by clearing snow? You're setting a precedent that other residents might follow, leading to a hodgepodge of individual snow removal that could damage property and create liability issues. An older man in the back raised his hand. "I don't understand the problem." Frank helped Dorothy Chen. "That seems like good neighbor behavior to me." Brenda's expression hardened. "The HOA has contracted professional services to handle snow removal. If residents start taking matters into their own hands, we'll have chaos." Chaos, I repeated. You're calling helping an elderly woman chaos. I'm calling unauthorized equipment operation a covenant violation. The fine stands unless 3 board members vote to overturn it. She looked at the other 4 board members. Gerald immediately said, I support upholding the fine. The other 3 shifted uncomfortably. A middle-aged woman named Patricia spoke up. I think maybe we could reduce the fine given that Frank is new to the community and might not have understood the rules. The violation is clear, Brenda said. We need to send a message about compliance. Patricia looked at me apologetically. I vote to reduce the fine to $100. The other 2 board members, clearly wanting to avoid conflict, agreed with Patricia. Brenda's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Fine. The reduced fine is $100, due by December 31st. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was better than $500. I paid the fine the next day, fuming the entire time. I told Dorothy what had happened, and she was mortified. Frank, I'm so sorry. I never thought you'd get in trouble for helping me. Don't worry about it, Dorothy. This isn't your fault. Brenda has some kind of control issue. She's been president for 6 years. People are afraid to run against her because she makes life difficult for anyone who opposes her. I filed that information away and went back to settling into my new home. Winter deepened across Duluth, and the snow kept coming. Northern Star Snow Services did an adequate job on the main roads, but often didn't show up until afternoon, leaving residents stuck in their driveways if they needed to leave early for work. I shoveled my driveway by hand and helped Dorothy with hers, making sure not to use the snowplow attachment. Brenda drove by several times, slowing down to watch, but I wasn't violating any rules. January brought a cold snap that dropped temperatures to 20 below zero. My truck started struggling, and I took it to a mechanic who told me the transmission was dying. The repair would cost $3,500 on a truck that was worth maybe $6,000. I made the mistake of mentioning this to Dorothy, who told me her nephew ran an equipment auction business and often had good deals on used vehicles. He's got a sale coming up next week. Might be worth checking out. I went to the auction mostly out of curiosity. It was held in a warehouse in Superior, Wisconsin, just across the bay from Duluth. Rows of equipment sat waiting for buyers: forklifts, tractors, excavators, and various trucks. I wasn't planning to buy anything heavy, but I wandered through the lots anyway, appreciating the machinery after years working in mining. That's when I saw it. A Caterpillar 305 mini excavator, painted yellow and showing some wear but looking mechanically sound. The placard said it had been repossessed from a landscaping company that went bankrupt. Starting bid was $5,000. I had no use for an excavator. I didn't need an excavator. But something about seeing that machine sitting there, forgotten and waiting for a second chance, resonated with me. I'd spent 32 years operating equipment just like it. I knew how to maintain it, repair it, and use it. And standing in that cold warehouse, thinking about Brenda's fine and her ridiculous rules, an idea started forming in my head. The auction for the excavator started at 2 p.m. Only 3 people bid. I won it for $5,700. The auctioneer, a friendly guy named Tom, helped me arrange transport. You got a good deal on this one. Engine solid, hydraulics recently serviced. What are you planning to use it for? Property maintenance, I said, which was technically true. The excavator arrived at my house on a flatbed trailer 2 days later. I had the driver park it in my backyard, using the access gate on the side of my property. The machine fit perfectly next to my detached garage, hidden from street view by my house and a row of pine trees. Dorothy came over that evening with a casserole. Frank, what on earth are you doing with that thing? I'm going to use it for some landscaping projects in the spring. Maybe dig out a fire pit, level some ground for a shed. She looked skeptical but didn't push it. Just be careful. Brenda has eyes everywhere. I spent the next week going over the excavator, checking every system and making minor repairs. The machine was in better shape than I'd expected. Whoever had maintained it before the company went under had done good work. I changed the oil, replaced the air filters, and tested the hydraulics until I was confident everything worked smoothly. The snow kept falling. By late January, Duluth was buried under a winter that locals said was the worst in a decade. Northern Star snow services couldn't keep up. They'd clear the main roads but leave huge berms at the end of driveways that took residents hours to dig through. Several people complained at the February HOA meeting, but Brenda insisted the service was adequate and within the contract terms. "If you're unsatisfied, you can shovel your own driveways," she said, as if that solved everything. An elderly man named Richard spoke up. "Some of us can't shovel anymore. My wife has a bad back, and we've been trapped in our house twice this month waiting for the service to show up." The contract specifies snow removal within 24 hours of cessation of snowfall. They've met that obligation. 24 hours is too long when people need to get to work or medical appointments. Brenda's expression turned cold. "Then perhaps you should have considered those limitations before choosing to live in Minnesota." The room went silent. Several people stared at Brenda in disbelief. Richard looked like he'd been slapped. Patricia, the board member who'd voted to reduce my fine, spoke up. "Brenda, that's unnecessarily harsh. Richard has a legitimate concern. And I've given a legitimate answer. The HOA is meeting its contractual obligations. This discussion is closed." I watched this exchange and felt my earlier plan solidify into determination. Brenda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was wielding power for its own sake, making people's lives harder because she could. Someone needed to push back. The next major snowstorm hit on February 14th, Valentine's Day. It started around midnight and dumped 18 inches by morning. I woke up at 6 a.m. to a world buried in white. Northern Star didn't show up that day. At 2 p.m., their automated system sent a message saying they were overwhelmed and would reach Whispering Pines by the following morning. That evening, after dark, I started the excavator. The machine fired up with a rumble that made me grin. I'd missed this, the visceral connection between operator and equipment, the precision control of something powerful. The excavator had a bucket attachment that was perfect for snow. I'd practiced with it the previous week, getting comfortable with the controls again after years away from this specific model. I started with my own driveway, using the bucket to scoop and push snow into neat piles at the edge of my property. The excavator made quick work of what would have taken hours by hand. Then I moved to Dorothy's driveway. Then Richard's. I worked through the night, moving methodically through the community, clearing driveways and creating paths for residents who'd been trapped. The excavator's lights cut through the darkness as I worked. A few residents came out to watch, bundled in heavy coats. One man started recording on his phone. I waved but kept working. By 4 a.m., I'd cleared 23 driveways and created emergency access paths through several berms. I returned the excavator to my backyard as dawn broke and went inside to sleep, exhausted but satisfied. The violation notice arrived before noon. I found it taped to my door when I woke up. This one was different. Instead of a $500 fine, it threatened immediate legal action and demanded I remove the excavator from the property within 72 hours. Violation notice: illegal commercial operation and unauthorized equipment storage. Resident Frank Bradshaw operated heavy machinery within community boundaries without authorization, creating significant liability exposure for the association. Additionally, storage of commercial equipment violates Covenant Section 8.2. The equipment must be removed immediately, and the resident must appear before the board for disciplinary action up to and including liens against the property. My phone rang. It was Dorothy, and she sounded panicked. "Frank, Brenda is furious. She called me demanding to know if you cleared my driveway." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were a good Samaritan helping your neighbors. She said you were a liability and she's going to make sure you face consequences." "Let her try." "Frank, she can put a lien on your house. She can force you to sell." "Not if she's violating her own rules. She can't." I spent that afternoon calling lawyers. The third one I reached, a woman named Susan Nordstrom who specialized in HOA law, agreed to meet with me the next day. I explained the situation, showed her the violation notices and the covenant documents, and waited while she read through everything. "This is interesting," Susan said. Section 8.2 prohibits commercial equipment storage, but defines commercial equipment as vehicles or machinery used in the regular course of business operations. You're not operating a business. That's what I told Brenda. The more significant issue is their selective enforcement. If they're allowing some residents to have boats, RVs, or other large equipment on their property but singling you out for the excavator, that's a problem. "Do you have evidence of selective enforcement?" "I can get it." I spent the next week documenting everything. I drove through Whispering Pines photographing properties with boats on trailers, RVs in driveways, and one guy who had a full commercial lawn care setup, including a large trailer and industrial mowers. None of them had been cited for covenant violations. I compiled everything into a folder and brought it to Susan. "This is perfect," she said. "We can argue selective enforcement and arbitrary rule application, but I need to warn you, fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. They have legal funds and they can drag this out." I'm not backing down. Good, because I think we can win this. The board hearing was scheduled for March 1st. Susan came with me, which seemed to surprise Brenda when we walked in. The clubhouse was packed. Word had spread about my snow-clearing operation, and dozens of residents had shown up to watch. Brenda called the meeting to order with Gerald beside her. The other 3 board members looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Bradshaw, you're here regarding multiple covenant violations. Do you have anything to say before the board makes its determination?" Susan stood up. "I'm Susan Nordstrom, representing Mr. Bradshaw. Before we proceed, I'd like to address the legality of these violation notices. The covenants define commercial equipment as machinery used in regular business operations. My client isn't operating a business. He cleared snow from his own property and helped neighbors during an emergency when your contracted service failed to appear." Brenda's expression didn't change. "The board has discretion to interpret covenant violations. Discretion isn't unlimited. It must be applied consistently and reasonably. We have documentation showing that multiple properties in this community have equipment that could be classified as commercial under your interpretation, yet none of them have been cited." Susan laid out the photos on the table. Brenda glanced at them and waved her hand dismissively. "Those are different situations." "How are they different? They're not operating machinery on community property." Mr. Bradshaw operated machinery on his own property and on driveways with the homeowner's permission. Gerald leaned forward. "He created a public spectacle and undermined the HOA's contracted services. He helped residents who your contracted service had abandoned during a snowstorm. Several of those residents are here today. Would you like to hear from them?" Brenda tried to cut her off. "That's not necessary." But Richard was already standing. "I'd like to speak. Frank cleared my driveway when your service left us stranded. My wife needed to get to a doctor's appointment. We would have missed it without his help." An older woman stood up. "Frank cleared my driveway at 2 in the morning. I'm a nurse at St. Luke's Hospital, and I needed to get to work for the morning shift. The HOA service didn't show up until the next afternoon." One by one, residents stood up sharing stories. Dorothy talked about her mobility issues. A young couple talked about needing to get their sick child to urgent care. A man who worked night shifts talked about being unable to get home because his driveway was impassable. Brenda tried to regain control. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that Mr. Bradshaw violated community covenants." Susan pulled out another document. "Actually, I've reviewed Minnesota HOA law and your specific covenants. You can't fine or penalize a resident for emergency assistance to neighbors. Furthermore, your selective enforcement pattern suggests discriminatory application of rules, which violates state fair housing regulations. Are you threatening this board with legal action? I'm informing you that if you proceed with these violations, we'll file suit for harassment and discriminatory enforcement. We'll also petition to remove the current board for mismanagement." The room erupted. Residents started talking over each other. Patricia called for order and then turned to Brenda. "I think we need to reconsider this. Frank was helping people during an emergency. That's not what our covenants are meant to prevent." Gerald shook his head. "If we let this go, we're setting a precedent that anyone can violate covenants if they claim good intentions." "Or," Susan said calmly, "you're acknowledging that covenants should be applied with common sense and community welfare in mind." The board voted. Patricia and the other 2 members voted to dismiss the violations. Brenda and Gerald voted to uphold them. 3-2, I was cleared. Brenda stood up, her face flushed with anger. "This isn't over. The excavator still violates storage rules." Susan smiled. "Actually, Mr. Bradshaw isn't storing it permanently. He's keeping it temporarily while he completes landscaping projects on his property, which is allowed under Section 9.4 for construction and improvement activities. He's not doing any landscaping. It's winter. He'll begin in spring. Until then, the equipment is stored on his property, out of sight from the street, which complies with aesthetic requirements." Brenda looked like she wanted to explode, but there was nothing she could say. The meeting ended and residents crowded around me offering congratulations and thanks. Several people asked if I'd clear their driveways during the next storm. I told them I would, free of charge if Northern Star failed to show up. That next storm came 2 weeks later. 12 inches overnight, and Northern Star's automated system announced they were delayed until the following day. I started the excavator at 6 a.m. this time, no longer worried about hiding what I was doing. I cleared driveways for anyone who needed it, working through the morning while Brenda watched from her SUV parked at the end of the street. She reported me to the township, claiming I was operating construction equipment in a residential zone without proper permits. A code enforcement officer named Dave came out to investigate. He watched me work for about 10 minutes, then came over to talk. Someone filed a complaint about noise and equipment operation. I'm clearing snow for my neighbors. Yeah, I can see that. You got a CDL for operating this thing. I don't need one on private property. Dave nodded. That's true. Are you charging anyone? Nope. Doing it for free. Then I don't see a violation. Technically, you're doing property maintenance, which is allowed. Just try to keep the noise down before 7 a.m. if you can. Will do. Dave left, and I continued working. Brenda's SUV disappeared shortly after, but the war wasn't over. If anything, it was escalating. The next violation notice came in April, just as snow was finally melting. This one claimed I was storing hazardous materials because the excavator used diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid. Susan laughed when I showed her. They're grasping at straws. This won't hold up. It didn't, but Brenda kept trying. She filed complaints about the grass in my yard being too long, even though it was the same height as everyone else's. She claimed my truck was parked too close to the street. She reported my garbage cans being visible from the road on non-collection days, even though I'd brought them in within the covenant-required time frame. Other residents started coming forward with stories about Brenda's behavior. A man named Tom Harrison told me she'd find him repeatedly for having Christmas lights up past January 15th, even though other houses in the community left theirs up longer. A woman named Cheryl described being harassed about her garden gnomes violating aesthetic standards. Pattern after pattern of selective enforcement and petty tyranny. In May, a group of residents approached me about running for the HOA board. Elections were scheduled for June, and they wanted to challenge Brenda's control. "We need someone who'll stand up to her," Patricia said. She'd resigned from the board in March after Brenda had verbally attacked her during a meeting. "You've already shown you're willing to fight. I don't want to be on the HOA board. I just want to live in peace. None of us will have peace as long as Brenda runs things." I thought about it for a week before agreeing to run. Susan helped me review the election procedures to make sure everything was done correctly. Brenda tried to challenge my candidacy, claiming I had outstanding violations that made me ineligible, but Susan shot that down immediately. The campaign was brief and surprisingly nasty. Brenda sent letters to every resident warning about the dangerous precedent of electing someone who flagrantly violated community standards. I countered by hosting a neighborhood barbecue where residents could share their concerns about HOA management. The turnout shocked me. Over 60 people showed up, and story after story emerged about Brenda's behavior. She'd been harassing residents for years, but people had been afraid to speak out because she'd threatened them with fines and liens. The barbecue turned into something like a therapy session, with people finally feeling safe to share their experiences. Dorothy helped organize a letter-writing campaign highlighting the issues. Richard created a petition calling for board reform. The younger residents started a Facebook group documenting covenant violations and selective enforcement patterns. The community was mobilizing in a way it hadn't in years. Election day was June 15th. Voting took place at the clubhouse between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. I spent the day nervously checking my phone while Susan assured me that the turnout was unprecedented. The results were announced at 8 p.m. I won by a landslide, along with 4 other reform candidates. Brenda lost her seat. Gerald lost his. We'd completely flipped the board. Brenda stood up when the results were announced, her face pale with shock and fury. "This is a travesty. You people have no idea what you've done. This community will fall apart without proper leadership." Patricia, who'd won the board president position, responded calmly. "Thank you for your service, Brenda. We'll take it from here." Brenda grabbed her things and stormed out. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks after the election, residents started reporting vandalism. Garden decorations destroyed, mailboxes damaged, paint splattered on houses. It happened at night, targeting people who'd been vocal about supporting the board reform. Tom Harrison's truck got keyed. Cheryl's garden gnomes were smashed to pieces. Someone poured motor oil across Richard's driveway. I suspected Brenda immediately, but had no proof. I installed security cameras around my property and encouraged other residents to do the same. Dorothy bought a Ring doorbell system. The vandalism continued sporadically through July. The police investigated but found no leads. Then, in early August, Dorothy's camera caught something. A white SUV driving slowly past houses late at night. The license plate was partially visible. I took the footage to the police. Detective Maria Santos reviewed it and ran the partial plate. This matches a vehicle registered to Brenda Patterson. Does that name mean anything to you? She's the former HOA president. We've had conflicts with her. What kind of conflicts? I explained the whole situation, the snow clearing, the fines, the election. Detective Santos listened carefully, taking notes. Let me look into this further. Can you get me a list of all the vandalism victims and their connection to the HOA election? I worked with Patricia to compile everything. Every vandalism victim had either supported the reform candidates or spoken out against Brenda at meetings. The pattern was clear. Detective Santos brought Brenda in for questioning. At first, Brenda denied everything, claiming her SUV had been stolen. But when confronted with footage from multiple cameras showing her vehicle near vandalism sites on the nights incidents occurred, her story fell apart. She'd been conducting a campaign of petty revenge, damaging property, and trying to intimidate the people who'd voted her out. She'd even considered targeting my excavator but couldn't get into my backyard without being caught. The charges included criminal mischief, vandalism, and destruction of property. With evidence from multiple cameras and the clear pattern of targeted attacks, the prosecutor felt confident about securing convictions. Brenda's arraignment was scheduled for September. I attended with several other victims. She showed up in a business suit, looking defiant until the judge read the charges and the evidence summary. When he mentioned possible jail time, her composure cracked. Her lawyer tried to argue that this was a community dispute blown out of proportion, that Brenda had been under stress from the election and had poor judgment. The prosecutor countered with the systematic nature of the attacks and the significant property damage involved. In the end, Brenda pled guilty to multiple counts of criminal mischief in exchange for a reduced sentence. She received 90 days in jail, 3 years probation, and was ordered to pay restitution to all victims. She was also required to stay away from Whispering Pines community and have no contact with residents. The day she started her jail sentence, the new HOA board held its first official meeting. We voted to revise the covenant enforcement procedures, creating clear definitions and fair appeal processes. We renegotiated the snow removal contract to require faster response times. We established a community assistance fund to help residents who needed support with property maintenance. And we officially recognized that neighborhood cooperation and mutual aid were fundamental values that covenants should support, not prohibit. I kept the excavator. In the spring, I did exactly what I told Brenda I would do. I used it for landscaping projects. I dug out a fire pit in my backyard, leveled ground for a shed, and helped Dorothy create a raised garden bed she could maintain without bending over. Several other residents asked to borrow it, and I spent weekends helping with various projects around the community. The equipment that Brenda had tried so hard to ban became a symbol of what a community could be when people worked together instead of against each other. That repossessed excavator, forgotten at an auction and given a second chance, had helped me fight back against petty tyranny and build something better. Tom Harrison organized a community day in October where we celebrated the reformed HOA and recognized residents who'd helped during the previous winter's storms. Dorothy baked pies. Richard gave a speech about standing up for what's right. Kids played in the clubhouse while adults shared food and conversation. I stood off to the side, watching people enjoy themselves, feeling something I hadn't expected when I'd moved here, a sense of belonging. This place had become home, not despite the conflict with Brenda, but perhaps partly because of it. Fighting for something makes you invested in it in a way that passive acceptance never can. Patricia came over with a slice of pie. You thinking deep thoughts. Just appreciating how things turned out. We couldn't have done it without you. You were the one willing to stand up first. I just cleared some snow. You did a lot more than that. You showed people they didn't have to accept abuse from someone with a little bit of power. I looked at the excavator parked in my backyard, visible through the open gate. I never thought buying that thing at auction would lead to all this. Best $5,700 you ever spent, might be. The winter that followed was easier. Northern Star improved their service dramatically after we renegotiated the contract. But when a major storm hit in January, dropping 2 feet of snow overnight and overwhelming even their improved capacity, I fired up the excavator and went to work. This time, several residents joined me with their own equipment, and we had the community cleared by midday. People brought out thermoses of coffee and hot chocolate, turning the work into a community event. Someone took a photo of me on the excavator, surrounded by neighbors, everyone bundled up against the cold and smiling. That photo ended up in the Duluth News-Tribune with an article about community cooperation during winter storms. The headline read, "Whispering Pines Residents Rally Together from HOA Conflict to Community Model." Susan framed a copy and gave it to me. "You should be proud of this. I just didn't want to pay a ridiculous fine. You created change that helped dozens of people. That matters." She was right, though it was strange to think about. I'd moved to Whispering Pines looking for a quiet retirement, a place to live out my years in peace after decades of hard work. Instead, I'd found myself in the middle of a conflict that forced me to be more engaged and involved than I'd planned. But maybe that was better. Maybe retirement wasn't supposed to be about checking out and waiting for time to pass. Maybe it was about finding new ways to contribute, new challenges to face, new connections to build. The excavator sat in my backyard through that winter and into the next spring, a bright yellow reminder that sometimes the most important tools are the ones you don't expect to need. I used it to help Richard build a retaining wall, to help Tom dig a foundation for a garage addition, to help Cheryl create a pond in her backyard. Each project brought neighbors together, turned individual problems into community solutions, and reinforced the bonds that had formed during our fight against Brenda's tyranny. The excavator became something more than a piece of equipment. It became a symbol of what we'd built together. In March of that second year, the township held a Community Service Awards ceremony. I was nominated for helping residents during the previous winters and for my role in reforming the HOA. I almost didn't attend, uncomfortable with formal recognition, but Dorothy insisted. The ceremony was held at the Township Hall, with local officials and residents in attendance. When they called my name, I walked up to accept a plaque while people applauded. The township supervisor, a friendly woman named Karen Lindstrom, shook my hand. Frank Bradshaw, for outstanding community service and dedication to neighbor welfare. Your actions during emergency situations and your work to improve community governance have made Whispering Pines a better place to live. I gave a brief speech, thanking the residents who'd supported the reform effort and emphasizing that everything we'd accomplished had been a group effort. But as I looked out at the audience, seeing Dorothy and Richard and Tom and Cheryl and dozens of others, I felt something profound. I'd found my place. I'd found my people. This retirement life, messy and complicated and unexpected as it had been, was exactly what I needed. After the ceremony, Dorothy hugged me. "Your wife would be proud. I know you don't talk about her much, but I can tell this is what she would have wanted for you." She was right. Linda and I had divorced years ago, but we'd parted as friends, and she'd always encouraged me to stay engaged with life, to keep fighting for what mattered. She would have loved this story. She would have laughed at the absurdity of buying an excavator at auction to fight an HOA president, and she would have been fierce in supporting the battle. Thanks, Dorothy. That means a lot. The summer brought new projects and new challenges. The board decided to update the playground equipment at the community park, and I volunteered to help with the excavation work. We turned it into a community build, with residents of all ages contributing labor. Parents worked alongside retirees. Teenagers helped younger kids plant flowers. The excavator dug out old equipment foundations and prepared the ground for new installations. During one of those work days, a younger resident named Jason asked me about the original conflict with Brenda. His family had moved in after the election, and he'd only heard pieces of the story. "So she really tried to fine you $500 just for clearing your driveway." She did. And then kept escalating until she ended up vandalizing property and going to jail. That's insane. Why would someone care that much about HOA rules? I thought about that question while I operated the excavator, carefully removing old concrete. I think some people get power and forget it's supposed to serve a purpose beyond itself. Brenda stopped thinking about what was good for the community and started thinking about maintaining control. Once that happened, every challenge to her authority became a threat she had to eliminate. But you challenged her and won. Not just me. A lot of people challenged her together. That's the only reason it worked. Jason nodded thoughtfully. My dad says we're lucky to live here now, that it could have stayed miserable if people hadn't fought back. Your dad's a smart guy. The playground project finished in July, and we held a grand opening with a cookout and games. Kids swarmed over the new equipment while adults stood around chatting and watching. The excavator sat nearby, having completed its role in yet another community improvement. Someone had tied balloons to it, and children kept asking if they could sit in the operator's seat. I lifted several kids up, showing them the controls and letting them pretend to drive while their parents took pictures. Patricia came over with a plate of food. You know what's funny? That excavator has probably done more for community relations than any HOA initiative in years. It's a pretty great excavator. It's more than that. It represents something. People see it and remember that we can solve our own problems, that we don't have to wait for someone else's permission to help each other. She was right, but I hadn't thought of it that way. To me, the excavator was just a tool, a piece of equipment I knew how to operate. But symbols matter, and if this machine had become a symbol of community resilience and cooperation, that was something worth preserving. Fall arrived with its usual Minnesota brilliance, leaves turning gold and red across the woods behind our properties. The new board had been operating for over a year, and the difference in community atmosphere was stark. People smiled more, attended meetings, volunteered for projects. The fear and resentment that had characterized Brenda's rule had been replaced by genuine neighborliness. I was raking leaves one October afternoon when a car pulled up, and Susan got out. We'd stayed in touch after the case concluded, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss HOA law and community governance. "Frank, I wanted to tell you something. Remember how we discussed potentially suing the HOA for harassment and selective enforcement?" "Yeah, but we dropped that after Brenda lost the election." "Right. Well, several other HOA attorneys have contacted me asking about the case. Your situation has become something of a teaching example in HOA law circles. The combination of selective enforcement, emergency assistance, and community organizing is being used to train lawyers about proper covenant application. I leaned on my rake. I'm a case study. You're an example of how residents can effectively challenge HOA overreach while building community support. It's actually quite remarkable. I just didn't want to pay a fine. Susan laughed. You keep saying that, but the impact has been much larger. Several Minnesota HOAs have revised their covenant enforcement procedures after hearing about what happened here. You've contributed to meaningful change beyond Whispering Pines. That was a strange thing to process. I'd never intended to be part of any broader movement or change. I just wanted to clear my driveway and help my neighbors. But actions ripple outward in ways we can't always predict or control. Is that good or bad? It's very good. HOAs need accountability, and your case provided a clear example of how things can go wrong and how to fix them. You should be proud. After Susan left, I continued raking, thinking about everything that had happened since I'd moved to Whispering Pines. The conflict, the legal battles, the community organizing, the election, the vandalism, the trial. It had been exhausting and stressful and often infuriating. But it had also been meaningful in a way my mining career, for all its steady reliability, had never quite been. Working in the mines, I'd operated equipment and done my job well, but I'd been a cog in a larger machine. Here, I'd been an individual who made a difference, whose actions had direct and visible impacts on people's lives. That mattered in a profound way. Dorothy came over with a basket of vegetables from her garden. I wanted to thank you again for helping me build those raised beds. I've had the best harvest in years. Happy to help. Your tomatoes are legendary. I'm making sauce this weekend if you want to come over. I'll teach you my recipe. I'd like that. As Dorothy walked back to her house, I realized that this was retirement done right. Not isolation or leisure for its own sake, but connection and contribution and purpose. The excavator had been the tool that cracked open this new life, but the life itself was built on relationships and shared effort. The second winter in my reformed community was almost pleasant. Snow fell, we cleared it together, and life continued without the stress of worrying about violation notices. Brenda finished her jail sentence and moved out of state, we heard through the grapevine. The house she'd lived in sold to a young family with 3 kids, who immediately became active in community events. I kept the excavator maintained and ready, using it for winter clearing when needed and spring projects when the weather warmed. It became such a fixture of community life that when the township wanted to feature local stories in their newsletter, they asked to interview me about it. The reporter, a young woman named Emily, came to my house in April. She photographed the excavator and asked about its history, about the conflict with Brenda, about the community changes that had followed. What would you say to other people dealing with difficult HOAs? She asked. Document everything. Find allies. Don't back down when you know you're right. And remember that covenants are supposed to serve the community, not the other way around. Do you regret buying the excavator? I looked at the machine sitting in my backyard, sunlight gleaming off its yellow paint. Not for a second. Best decision I made after moving here. The article ran in May with the headline, Retired Equipment Operator Transforms Community with Repossessed Excavator. It was picked up by several regional papers and even got some attention on social media. I received emails from people around the country sharing their own HOA horror stories and asking for advice. I tried to respond to as many as I could, though I was no expert. I'd just been stubborn and lucky enough to have good legal help and community support. But if my story encouraged other people to stand up against unreasonable HOA boards, that seemed worthwhile. The third summer in Whispering Pines brought a heat wave, and someone suggested installing a splash pad at the community park. The board approved it, funds were allocated, and I volunteered the excavator for the excavation work. We dug out the necessary area in late June, and by July the splash pad was operational, with kids running through spraying water while parents watched from shaded benches. At the opening celebration, Richard gave a speech about community progress. 3 years ago, this community was defined by fear and petty rules. Today, it's defined by cooperation and innovation. We have Frank Bradshaw and his famous excavator to thank for starting that change, but we all contributed to making it real. People applauded, and I felt that now familiar mix of pride and embarrassment. I hadn't set out to be a community leader or change agent. I just refused to accept injustice and been willing to fight for what was right. Sometimes that's all it takes. Tom came over during the celebration. "Hey Frank, my brother-in-law is moving to a subdivision near Hibbing. Their HOA is apparently pretty terrible. I told him to talk to you." What am I supposed to tell him? How to fight back, how to organize? You've done it before. Every situation is different. Yeah, but the principles are the same. Stand up, build support, don't back down, right? He wasn't wrong. The specific details of conflicts varied, but the underlying dynamics of power, community, and justice were consistent. If I could help other people navigate those dynamics, maybe that was part of my purpose now. I met with Tom's brother-in-law, a guy named Marcus, in August. He described a situation eerily similar to what I'd faced. An overbearing board president, selective enforcement, fines for trivial violations. I walked him through my experience, emphasized the importance of documentation and legal advice, and encouraged him to find allies among his neighbors. "The hardest part is getting people to speak up," Marcus said. "Everyone's afraid of retaliation. That's why you start with people who have already been targeted. They have less to lose and more motivation to act. Build from there." 6 months later, Marcus called to tell me his community had successfully recalled their board and elected reform candidates. They'd used many of the strategies that had worked in Whispering Pines, adapting them to their specific situation. He thanked me repeatedly, his voice full of relief and excitement. "We have our community back. People can breathe again." "That's great, Marcus. You did the hard work, though. I just shared some ideas. You gave us a roadmap. That mattered more than you know." After that call, I sat in my backyard watching the sun set behind the trees. The excavator sat nearby, a constant presence in my life now. I'd bought it on impulse, seeing a tool that reminded me of my working years and feeling a connection I couldn't fully explain at the time. That impulse purchase had become the catalyst for community transformation and apparently even broader influence. Life takes strange turns. Planning only gets you so far. Sometimes you have to respond to circumstances, stand up when tested, and trust that good outcomes are possible even in difficult situations. The fourth winter brought lighter snow than previous years, but I still cleared driveways when Northern Star was overwhelmed. The routine had become comfortable, almost meditative. Start the excavator, work methodically through the community, wave at neighbors, pile snow neatly, and return home feeling useful. In February, Patricia announced she was stepping down as board president due to work commitments. The board asked if I'd consider taking the role. I initially declined, not wanting that level of responsibility. But after talking with Dorothy and Richard and Tom, I reconsidered. Someone had to lead, and I understood what the community needed. I became HOA board president in March, 4 years after moving to Whispering Pines. The role was less onerous than I'd feared. We'd established good systems and procedures, residents were engaged and supportive, and conflicts were resolved through reasonable discussion rather than authoritarian decree. The contrast with Brenda's leadership couldn't have been starker. Where she'd ruled through fear and control, we governed through transparency and collaboration. Where she'd seen residents as subjects to be managed, we saw them as partners in building community. The difference in outcomes was dramatic. By the spring of that 4th year, Whispering Pines had become something special. Property values had increased as word spread about our reformed HOA and strong community bonds. Young families wanted to move in, attracted by the playground, splash pad, and neighborhood culture. Long-time residents stayed instead of moving away, no longer driven out by harassment and excessive fines. The Excavator, now a beloved community fixture, was featured in the township's promotional materials. Whispering Pines, a community that works together. Read the caption under a photo of the machine surrounded by residents during a project day. In June, the original board members who'd supported reform organized a 5-year anniversary celebration. 5 years since we'd flipped the board, transformed the community, and proved that positive change was possible. The celebration was held at the park with food trucks, live music, and activities for kids. During the event, Dorothy pulled me aside. She looked older now, her hair completely white and her movements slower, but her eyes were sharp and warm. "Frank, I want you to know something. When you moved here, I thought you were just another grumpy retiree who wanted to be left alone. I'm glad I was wrong." I was a grumpy retiree who wanted to be left alone. But you became more than that. You became someone who stood up when it mattered. That changed everything for all of us. You would have stood up eventually. Someone would have. Maybe. But you did it when we needed it most. That's what heroes do. I'm not a hero, Dorothy. I just didn't want to pay a ridiculous fine. She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Keep telling yourself that. The rest of us know better. As the sun set over the celebration, I stood near the Excavator watching people enjoy themselves. Kids played, adults chatted, music drifted through the warm evening air. This was what community was supposed to feel like. Safe, supportive, joyful. The Excavator's yellow paint glowed in the golden light. That machine, repossessed from a failed business and bought on impulse at an auction, had become the unlikely tool of community transformation. It had helped me fight back against petty tyranny, provided practical assistance during emergencies, and symbolized the power of neighbors working together. But more than that, it had given me purpose when I'd been drifting. It had connected me to people when I'd been alone. It had proven that retirement wasn't about withdrawal, but about finding new ways to contribute and engage. Tom came over with his kids, the youngest asking if she could sit in the Excavator. I lifted her up into the operator's seat and showed her the controls, watching her face light up with excitement. Her older brother wanted to turn next, then other kids lined up, and I spent the next hour giving Excavator demonstrations while parents watched and laughed. This was my life now. Not the solitary retirement I'd imagined, but something richer and more meaningful. I'd become part of something larger than myself, contributed to something that would outlast my individual presence. The Excavator had been the tool, but the real work had been building relationships, standing up for justice, and believing that communities could be better. As the celebration wound down and people started heading home, Richard approached me. "Frank, I'm thinking about running for township supervisor next year. Would you support me?" "Absolutely. You'd be great at it." I wouldn't have the confidence to try if I hadn't seen what we accomplished here. You showed me that regular people can challenge power structures and win. We all showed each other that. It wasn't just me. True, but you were the catalyst. Own that. After everyone left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to crickets and distant traffic. The excavator sat silent beside me, its day's work done. Tomorrow it would be ready for whatever was needed, digging, clearing, building, helping, just like me. I thought about the path that had brought me here, from mining operations in the Iron Range to this suburban community, from career operator to retiree to community leader. None of it had been planned. All of it had been necessary. The excavator represented that journey. A tool repossessed from failure, bought by someone looking for purpose, and transformed into an instrument of community building. We'd both found second chances in Whispering Pines, both proven that setbacks and challenges could lead to unexpected opportunities. As I finally headed inside for the night, I glanced back at the excavator one more time. Yellow paint gleaming in the moonlight, bucket resting on the ground, hydraulic lines coiled and ready. It looked peaceful sitting there, this machine that had caused so much conflict and created so much good. I'd bought it for $5,700 at an auction in Superior, Wisconsin, not knowing it would change my life and help transform a community. Best $5,700 I ever spent, just like Patricia had said years ago. But the real value wasn't in the machine itself. It was in what the machine had enabled: resistance against injustice, support for neighbors, and the building of genuine community. That was the story I'd tell if anyone asked. Not about an HOA fine or a legal battle, though those were part of it. But about how sometimes a tool is just a tool until someone decides to use it for something that matters. About how communities are built through small acts of courage and mutual support. About how retirement doesn't mean stepping back from life, but finding new ways to engage with it. The excavator would be there tomorrow, ready for whatever project or emergency arose. And I would be there with it, operating the controls with decades of experience, serving my community with the same dedication I'd brought to my mining career. This was my purpose now, my contribution, my legacy. A repossessed excavator and a stubborn retiree had taken on an authoritarian HOA president, and won. But more importantly, we'd built something lasting. A community where people looked out for each other, where covenants served residents instead of controlling them, where justice and cooperation mattered more than power and rules. That was worth fighting for. That was worth $500 fines and legal fees and community organizing and all the stress and conflict. Because in the end, we'd created something good, something that would continue long after I was gone. The excavator would probably outlast me, maintained and ready, serving future residents and future projects. That seemed fitting. Tools endure when they're cared for, just like communities endure when people invest in them. I went to bed that night feeling satisfied in a way I hadn't since my early mining days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The excavator would be ready. So would I.